The brain recently, the organ of the brain and how it works, specifically how the chemistry of the brain works. And I learned this past week that the primary function of the brain is to make sure that your body actually does what it's supposed to do, that your heart actually beats, that you breathe, that you blink your eyes. All these things that you don't think about or think about, your brain does, and that's its primary function. Its secondary function is really to think. And the thinking portion is really about predicting. So as you're sitting here listening to me, you're predicting what I'm going to say, like a cat and a dog, you probably thought, or Mary had a little lamb. So your brain's constantly predicting what I'm going to say. It's constantly predicting that the floor is going to be there when you take a step. And there's a scientific term for when things happen that you don't predict. That very scientific word is called learning. So we're actually learning when something actually happens, or we're interacting with something that we didn't know before. So my aim, my goal tonight, as it was every night this quarter, is that you learn something. And with that, let's bow our heads and bless our study. Dear God, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for your Son, for your church, for the family that we have. We thank you for the opportunity to serve one another. We thank you for these vessels, this body, that we can praise your name and study your word and think about your word. Lord, we don't know how it all works, but you are the author, the creator of life. We worship you, we study you, we love you. Go with us tonight as we open your word. Let us gain knowledge from what you bless us with. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. Our memory verse this evening, our first memory verse, it comes from Proverbs 17:17, first part of that. A friend loves at all times. Can you repeat after me when I say it? A friend loves at all times. A friend loves at all times. One more time. I'll say it once and then you repeat. A friend loves at all times.
A friend loves at all times.
Excellent. That's going to be the essence of what we talk about tonight for the first half. So a friend loves at all time. I left a blank there for you to fill in. Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times. It's an active love. It's not a passive love. It's something that we do. It's an action. I thought it might make sense to spend a couple of minutes talking about some examples of friendship in the Bible, and I'll do as best as I can to step through them chronologically in the Bible. So we'll start in Genesis, and with anything biblical, I chose 12. So we have 12 friendships that we will highlight, and I want to highlight these friendships because I think it's a great example that you can write these down, you can go back and study different friendships. Perhaps there's others that I missed here, but really the 12 that came to mind were these. The first is Abraham and Lot. Abraham and Lot. And the key theme of that relationship really is around loyalty. If you would turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14, in verse 14, says, when Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. So we learn here loyalty. Abram went after Lot. He rescued Lot. Second example, Moses and Aaron. I think this friendship and brotherhood, it gives you a perspective that maybe you don't have. In Exodus, the situation that is going on in Exodus chapter 4, if you recall, Moses was struggling with things to say. He was struggling with what to say, and God said, hey, here's Aaron. He will come find you. He will give you, and he will speak for you. I will put words in your mouth to tell him, and I'll put words in his mouth. So sometimes our friends can round out our personality, can bring things that we don't have. one of my favorite scriptures in Ruth. I'm actually going to turn here, if you don't mind, turn in your Bibles to Ruth chapter 1. Judges, Ruth. If you recall, Naomi was widowed. She had two daughter-in-laws, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And it was time for Naomi to go back to her home country, but Ruth, in chapter 1, verse 16, such a beautiful thing that she says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." So you can have a strong friendship with your mother-in-law. It can go across ages. It can go across cultures. Fourth example, David and Jonathan. Sometimes friendship, I was just talking this evening about a friendship or an example of a friendship that seemed to just happen instantly. And we have that example with David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 1, a couple of pages over from Ruth. 1 Samuel chapter 18 describes that friendship of David and Samuel and how it was instantaneous, or seemed to be instantaneous. 1 Samuel 18, beginning in verse 1, it says, "As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul." Sometimes friendships bond like it's your own soul. Next example is David and Abiathar. They protected one another. So continuing on in 1 Samuel chapter 22 and verse 22, the Bible reads, "And David sent to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safe keeping." So friends protect friends. David and Nahash. It extends to those who love our friends. In 2 Samuel verse 10, it describes how a friend of his relative, a friend of his father, became his friend. And often I can think of times where a relative of mine and a friend of theirs becomes my friend because we have that commonality, as was the case with David and Nahash. In Job, if you recall in Job, Satan is tempting Job. He takes and makes his life physically miserable. It comes to the point where his wife even says, "Curse God and die." And it's at that point that Job's three friends, which I think is very interesting, Job's three friends, this is in Job chapter 2 and verse 11, it says, "Now when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to him to show sympathy." I don't know where these places are, but I got to think it was a lot more difficult for three people to coordinate. They couldn't just send texts to each other, but they coordinated and actually set a time to go and see Job in his misery when his wife had just told him to curse God and die. And then later on, they sat with them for 7 days in silence. Has any of your friends sat with you for 7 days in silence when you were in pain? That's a long time to sit. I haven't sat with any of my friends for 7 days, but these friends did. So it was purposeful. Like our memory verse says, a friend loves at all times. Those three friends loved Job to coordinate, to go and sit with him. We do that with our friends when they're in need. Elijah and Elisha, another example of loyalty. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. This is in Daniel. So the situation around this is when Daniel had just given the dream to the king, and he was praising Daniel, and Daniel quickly uplifted his friends and said, "Hey, let's appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So friends take care of each other. They look out for each other. The stories of Jesus, Mary, Martha, Lazarus. When Lazarus dies, how direct Martha was about how if Jesus were there, if you were there, Jesus, he wouldn't have died. Of course, we know the rest of that story. We also know the shortest verse of the Bible, and Jesus wept. He loved his friend Lazarus. Paul in Romans, talking about Priscilla and Aquila, recommending them, referring to them and introducing them to the church in Rome. And then, of course, Jesus and John, the disciple that Jesus loved. It's a great example of friendship. John was there when everybody else scattered. And Jesus said, "Mary, John, this is your mother now." So I give all those examples, and those are great examples for us to go back and look at friendships in the Bible. The rest of my portion, I'll give you 6 different characteristics. These are the blanks that are on your sheet. The first is constancy and loyalty. And that really is captured in Proverbs 17:17 as our memory verse. A friend loves at all times. And the rest of that verse, the second half is, and a brother is born for adversity. So constancy, loyalty. Maybe write down Proverbs 17:17 there, or an arrow up to that verse. The concept of business friends, Facebook friends. I was in the car on the way here and was astounded that my daughter has 800, friends on Instagram. I don't even know what that means. It's not friends. Still, it's not friends because Facebook's not cool anymore. But people that follow her, whatever. So Facebook friends seems to have its own connotation, or business friends, or fair weather friends, or maybe high school friends, or he was my college friend. We loosely use this term friend, but the term that I'm talking about is somebody that loves all the time, a true friend. When you think about life experiences, everything's better with friends. Even the bad moments are better with friends. The happy moments, the great moments, or even better with friends. In Proverbs, here's another verse. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 24. Proverbs 18 and 24. The Bible reads, "A man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother." Second characteristic is around keeping friends. There's some verses in Proverbs that really talk to this, and I think the American Standard Version captures this perhaps a little bit better in Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 22. Different versions of the Bible translate it differently, but the American Standard says, "That which maketh a man to be desired is his kindness." And we hear in Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of the Spirit. That's Galatians 5, verse 22 and 23. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are also very good characteristics of a friend. True friends have candor. They're direct. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 6. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy." Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Would you rather have a doctor that was nice to you or one that was honest with you? I think when everybody really thinks about that, it's probably both. But you want a doctor that's honest with you, that'll tell you the truth. If something is going on in your body, for example, you want them to tell you the truth. And you want your friends to tell you the truth, because faithful are the wounds of a friend. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 22. The proverb reads, "Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors they succeed." Jack Welch, one of the renowned business leaders, he led GE for years, was known for having a group whose sole purpose was to tell him bad news. Various leaders have had that same thing. Because often, the higher you get up in a company, people don't want to tell you the truth anymore. They want to tell you what they think you want to hear. Surround yourself with people that will be honest, they'll have candor, will be direct. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 9 says, "Oil and perfume make the heart glad, and the sweetness of a friend comes from his earnest counsel." Fourth is it makes you better. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 17. I always think of Brother Kelly Herbert when I think of this verse. "Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another." Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Are you surrounding yourself with people that make you better? Or are you surrounding yourself with the fifth point here, an anti-friend? In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 28, Proverbs 16 and verse 28, "A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends." Proverbs 16:28. "A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends." Proverbs 17 and verse 9. "Whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends." You surround yourself with people that remind you and rub your nose in your mistakes. Proverbs 13 and 20. "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." Study after study show that political beliefs, the life beliefs that you have, typically are a function of who you hang out with when you're in high school and college. That band of about 7-8 years, the people you hang out with will set how you believe about lots of things, including faith. So whoever walks with the wise become wise, but companions of fools suffer harm. Proverbs chapter 22, starting in verse 24. Proverbs 22 and 24 and 25. "Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare." Pretty direct. So those 4 verses really capture who you do not want to be friends with. Somebody you do want to be friends with, and the last of my list here, is Jesus. Jesus and you. Let's all turn to John chapter 15. John chapter 15. Probably the best friend that you could ever have. Not probably, the best friend you can ever have is Jesus. John chapter 15, starting in verse 12. It says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I choose you and appoint you that you should go and bear fruit, and that you bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another. So again, going back to the memory verse, a friend loves at all times. How do you become a friend with Jesus? I'll read it one more time. Verse 14. You are my friends if you do what I command you. That's how we become a friend of Jesus. With that, I'm going to transition things over to our next topic for the evening. Again, it's been a pleasure to be a part of the study, and thank you for your time.
If you're watching on Livestream and stepped away for a minute and came back, no, Landon did not gain about 50 pounds. So just want to make that clear. One of the benefits of Livestream is you can go back and watch yourself. And I realized I scratched my face some, and it's really loud in this microphone on Livestream, and I move around a lot, so I cause the guys to widen out. So I'm going to try and do a better job for all of our friends on Livestream. So as we move on tonight and wrap up this study on Proverbs, like Lennon said, we each had separate lessons that we're trying to boil down into a 2-hour lesson for you tonight. And I'm just kidding. And my lesson was more about some of the sins and some of the things that we face. And so I promise I'm going to try and wrap it all together. And these 2 lessons are going to make sense, because I know having 2 disjointed lessons can be sometimes confusing. But as we think about Proverbs and just the overall concept of it, Proverbs is really hard to teach in one quarter, especially a quarter that has snowmageddons and everything else built in. And so there's a lot of things packed in to Proverbs that we need to study and we need to know. There's a lot of sins we've already talked about as we've gone through here that Proverbs deals with. A lot of things that it deals with very directly. Things like, I taught a lesson on a man and his money, how we use our money. Gluttony, one thing we haven't talked about, deals very directly with gluttony. Drunkenness, adultery. We talked about words and tongue and the way we use our tongue. Anger, idleness. A lot of sins that Proverbs deals with directly. And, again, short little just, here's what you need to know about these sins, right? So as we think about sin, what are ways that sin can be described? Or if you were to define sin, what are some ways that we define sin? Missing the mark. That was my very first one. What was it? What did you say?
Going against God's will.
Going against God's will. Okay. Rebellion. That was my second one. You're doing good. I got 2 more. Transgression or flagrant disobedience. So kind of the same thing as rebellion, right? And then just evil desires, right? We studied a little bit the last time I taught on the inner man and the evil desires that are within our heart, right? And so these are all different ways that sin can be described, and in its simplest form, missing the mark, not doing what God's will is, right? That archery term. So think back to our lesson on the inner man that I taught. And how are our sins and free will related? So we know that we are one of God's greatest and most prized creations, right? And one of that is He's given us the free will. He's given us free will to choose and to do the things that we want to do, and hopefully that's in service to Him. But how are sin and free will related, or are they related? Okay, there's a theory that's been presented of if we didn't have free will, we wouldn't have the ability to sin, right? Because God could just make us all perfect, right? He could just make us all line up and follow in the same way. So I agree with that theory. I think sin and free will are closely aligned. Think about Matthew, right? Matthew 5, 21 through 23, Sermon on the Mount, right? Think about, you've heard that it was said. I've talked about that before in here. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, don't look after a woman lustfully. You've heard that it was said, do not kill your brother. But I say to you, do not be angry with your brother, right? And Jesus really goes back in the Sermon on the Mount and he talks about the evilness that's in our heart. And again, I spent a lot of time talking about that in my last lesson of just this idea of out of our heart, right, the mouth flows. Out of our heart, that's where our actions are oriented from. And there's really, to me, there's three different types of sin, or three different categories of sin that I would propose to you tonight. 1, against God, 2, against another, and 3, against ourselves. So when you think about those sins, just the ones I mentioned and the ones that are listed through Proverbs, at first glance it may seem like, okay, well, isn't all sin against God? I mean, there can't be another type. And I would say, yes, it is. But I think there's also scriptural reference for sins against our own body, right? But our body is what? The temple of God, right? Our body is the temple of God. So they're all connected, but there's still a little bit of a difference there. Sins against God, that's obvious. That's, the blasphemy, in the Old Testament days, not keeping the Lord's day, not keeping the Sabbath day, right? Using the Lord's name in vain. Some of those that are against God. Then you have the sins against others, right? Those are pretty self-explanatory. That's the murder, the stealing, the adultery, the lying, the fraud, those type of sins that Proverbs deal with. And then you have the sins against ourselves, right? That's the gluttony, the drunkenness, fornication, adultery, abuse of our body we just talked about. You have so these three different types of sins that are there that, and if you look at the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments kind of follows that same pattern, right? You start out with the sins against God. Take no other gods before me. Then you shift into the sins against others. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's possessions. And then you get into sins about yourself, right? And so they all fit into those categories. But to me, as I started thinking about, okay, all of these sins that Proverbs deals with, and we could do a whole year's lesson on just the sins that Proverbs deals with, much less the whole book of Proverbs. But all these sins that Proverbs deals with, all of the different things that it says, all of these 9 lessons that we've gone through already, what do they kind of all have in common? What's the kind of the common theme? And as I was thinking, as I was studying, as I was kind of pouring through this, the one word, one common theme kind of stuck out to me. And that was discipline. And I think discipline has 2 different connotations. When I said discipline, be honest. We're in church, you got to be honest. When I say discipline, how many of you thought disciplining your kids? Raise your hand. Or like discipline in some form of punishment or some form of, correction. Nobody? Just Landon? Thank you for being honest. I got a couple. So maybe the parents that had kids that weren't behaving today, they're like, yep, me. Okay. How many of you thought when I said discipline, how many of you thought that's self-discipline? Good. That's impressive. Last time I kind of went through this with the previous congregation, it was completely flipped. So there's those 2 different kinds of discipline, right? There's the discipline of, Proverbs talk about, spare the rod or don't spare the rod, right? I can't remember the quote, so I won't say it exactly. But he talks about, not sparing the rod and disciplining your children, right? So there's obviously that form of discipline. But to me, the discipline that came as I started thinking about all these different lessons was that self-discipline or that self-control. And how does that self-control, how does that discipline relate to all this? So let's see what Peter has to say about self-control. So turn over to 1 Peter. We're going to read 2 different verses. 1 Peter 1:13. We're which is not up on the screen, but 1 Peter 1:13 says, "Therefore, prepare your minds for action, and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." And then skipping over a few chapters to 5:8 and what's on the screen. "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." So there we got two verses there, and there's a lot to dissect in just those two verses alone about self-control and about being sober-minded. But that overarching idea of self-control really sticks out. First, there's this idea, like I just said, be sober-minded, right? In both verses, prepare your mind for action, be sober-minded. In chapter 5, verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Okay? There's this overarching concept of being sober-minded. Some of your translations may say like sober spirit. They may say just be sober. Right? And when we think about sober, and probably our minds kind of go to alcohol, right? And alcoholism and sobriety and that realm. And I think that's very much the case, but it's a deeper meaning here, this idea of being sober. It's not just abstaining from alcohol. It's having a clear mind. There's so many different things, like Landon just talked about, that are going on in our brain, right? There's so many different things that can cloud our mind, that can cloud our judgment, that can cloud the things that we think about. And so really thinking about that idea of being sober-minded, being sober in our mind, that first step of how it gets rid of the distractions, the things that influence us negatively, the things that influence us to act upon some of those other things. We have to start with that clear mind. We have to start with that mind that's focused on the right things, the mind that's focused there. And then the second aspect of that is, hopefully you see in those verses, some idea of preparation, right? So there's this first idea of having this clear mind, being sober-minded, but then there's this idea of being prepared, and that they're both vitally important in preparing our minds. And so, be watchful, right? The chapter 1, verse 13 says, prepare your minds. And they're very important because our thoughts are always, if our thoughts are always submitted to the Word and the ways of Christ, then we'll be prepared in advance for these things, right? We'll be able to put our faith into action. We'll be able to put our faith into doing the things that God's prepared for us. And that's where self-control really does start with our heart and with our minds. This idea of discipline really starts, and it's all about that preparation. It's all about that setting ourselves up for success, right? You think about anything in life, and it's all about preparation. I didn't come up here tonight with wonder what I'm going to teach about, right? I came up here prepared. Landon didn't, I don't think he did. Well, actually, I know he didn't because he sent me his notes ahead of time. He didn't this afternoon write his lesson, right? We've been preparing for these things, right? In your job and the things that we do and in all of life's things, we prepare, right? Any presentations we give, classes we're teaching, sporting events, whatever, you're always better off if you're prepared. And why would we be prepared? Why do we need to be prepared? What does it say? Say it. The devil, right? You're going to get eaten, right? Thank you. You're going to get eaten, right? The devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour, right? Who is he going to devour? The person that's prepared or the person that's not prepared? Not prepared, right? The person that's not prepared. And that's how we can really start to overcome some of those sins that we talked about. Because those sins, like we talked about last week, they don't just sneak up on us. Yes, sometimes there's temptations, and there's parts in Proverbs where he's given his instruction to his son, and he says, son, if you're going down this path, is the woman that lusts after you. Don't go down that path, go down this path. Right? So there's sometimes where we can be walking along and we can have a temptation, bam, right in our face. Right? But if we're prepared on how we're going to handle that temptation, that allows us to quickly assess what's going on, make a U-turn, and go the other way. Right? No matter what it is. If, some people have problems with these things. Right? There's a lot of things that our youth group minister at our previous congregation did a lesson on phones, and I think he said it takes like 3 clicks on YouTube and you can get to something inappropriate. I mean, that's crazy. 3 clicks. Because, like you watch one video and that leads you to another category, which leads you to another category. And by the 3rd click, you're on something inappropriate. And you may not even meant to. Right? And how easy it is. But if we're prepared ahead of time with how we're going to deal with these situations, that's going to set us up for a lot better success. So how do we achieve this self-control? Obviously, discipline, what I just talked about, right? Both discipline from God, discipline from our parents, and from our others. And in this one, in this form of discipline, I'm more talking about the discipline of correction. So turn over to Proverbs. Let's read Proverbs chapter 10 and look at verse 8. Proverbs 10 and verse 8. The wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin. Right? Listening to the commandments. Being attentive to the things that are being said, right? We have obviously, discipline from God. Proverbs 3:11 talks about that if you want to write some of these down. Of how God disciplines us, right? Through His Word, through the ways that we act. From our parents, pretty self-explanatory, right? Our parents are people that disciplined us, hopefully, at a younger age. Some of us that are parents now are disciplining our kids. I don't think that stops. I think the honor your father and mother commandment is not for kids that are, 2 to 18. I think that's for everybody. Honor your father and mother. And then obviously discipline from others, from all of you, right? How each of us can help each other in our discipline of continuing to go down the right path. The other way we can achieve self-control is through self-restraint, right? And that gets more into the discipline side of it that I was talking about earlier, this resistance and fleeing temptation. Turn to Proverbs 24. Proverbs 24 verse 1 says, "Be not envious of evil men, nor desire to be with them." Because let's be real, those sins that I mentioned before, there's a lot of people that practice those sins blatantly and openly, and on the outside, they may look like they're living a great life, right? There's a lot of times where people that are not doing the things that they're supposed to do. They got the big house, they got the nice cars and all these different things, but they're not living the right life inside, right? Be not envious of evil men, nor desire to be with them. Don't even desire to be with them. And then obviously responsible behavior. Turn over to 23, back one chapter, 23 and verse 19. "Hear, my son, and be wise, and direct your heart in the way." Hear, my son, and be wise, and direct your heart in the way. So there's that implied action there, right? Direct your heart in the way. It's not just let things happen the way they are. It's have an intentional action in the way that we act to be able to direct ourselves to certain ways. And that's God's way, obviously. So in our last few minutes here, hopefully there's some room on your paper. What will you take away from this series in Proverbs? So I want you to go back and think about the 10 lessons. One of the great things about technology, all of our lessons are on YouTube. But I've put on the back the memory verses from all of the lessons except for tonight's. Landon's wrote up there. The one I'll leave you, I'd fail to put it on the screen, but the other one I'll leave you if you want to write it down. is Proverbs 24, 33 to 34. If you want to turn back over one more chapter to Proverbs 24. Proverbs 23, 33 to 34. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Is that telling us that we can't sleep? Obviously not. We all need our sleep, right? But I think it is telling us that we've got to be able to put ourselves into an actionable state of mind. We've got to have our minds clear so that we can move ourselves forward in the way God would want to go. Proverbs deals a lot with idleness. It deals a lot with laziness. Lazy people love to sleep. They can't start or stick with tasks. They're always coming up with excuses. They face consequences, right? Proverbs deals a lot with idleness. And I think that's what kept bringing me back to this idea of this action and this discipline of being kind of an overarching theme for Proverbs and how we get this wisdom that he's wanting us to get, right? Because Tim talked about in the very first lesson, he talked about the idea of, wisdom is there. God's advice is everywhere. We just have to take it, right? We have to be that continual learner. And there's that idea of that discipline and that action that really goes into each one of those things. Whether it's, again, lesson 1 dealing with, being a continual learner. Lesson 2 was nature of true wisdom. And I have the titles of the lessons there. And lesson 2 is nature of the true wisdom. And Jordan led us through a lot of different things about, is true wisdom, is it a life hack or something deeper? Is there, wisdom personified in the pursuit of wisdom? Again, listen for those action-oriented words. Glimpses of God. God is all seen. He's strong. He's just. He hates sin. He's merciful, right? We need to have reverence for God. A man and his money. We've already talked about it a little bit tonight, right? Prosperity doesn't mean we're living right, and poverty doesn't mean we're living wrong, but it could be an indication. And we need to make sure that we're taking care of each other. We need to make sure we're taking care of the blessings that God's given us, right? Tim led us through 9 lifestyle attributes for the virtuous woman in lesson 5, and just that overarching theme of, it applies to all women. And it's not a checkbox, it's not a checklist of, hey, this is what you have to be, but it's, hey, here's an aspiration, here's an ideal, right? Lesson 6 is a string of pearls. We have good news. We need to buy the truth, right? The memory verse from that one. Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. You hear the action there? Buy wisdom. Buy truth, right? Lesson 7, the power of the tongues. The words leading to death. We did the little wordle up on the board. Remember, we talked about lying, cursing, anger. A lot of the sins that Proverbs deals with were words that lead to death that we all put up there. And then words that lead to life, love, praise, encouragement, forgiveness, teaching, right? Landon kind of closed it with treat the symptoms, but ultimately treat the cause, which is the heart. And then we talked about the characteristics and consequences of a fool, and Jordan led us through a lot of different consequences of being the fool, and talked a lot about some of these sins and where it talks about the gluttony, the drunkenness, and other things, and how we can be misled by false teachers and we can reject the Word of God, right? And so as long as we are, as Christians, being diligent in our discipline and studying God's Word, being diligent in making sure that our hearts and our minds are aligned, they're sober, and they're ready for action, we can make sure that we resist the devil, right, and resist those temptations. We're not going to always be able to avoid them. We can resist them, and we can turn the other way, and we can correct the things that we're doing in our life. Really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to teach, and thanks for letting us walk you through Proverbs. So we've all tried to either teach something that really stuck out to us. Probably they were more, hey, these are things I need to learn more than I want to teach you. So hopefully you can answer this last question and be able to take away a few things that we can apply and take to our life. So if you're on Livestream, bear with us. We're going to transition over to our devotional time, and thanks again for your attention.